Members, the question is that clauses 1 to 5 stand apart. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. Contrary opinion will say no. The ayes have it. Party votes called for. Clerk, please conduct the party vote.
New Zealand National.
58 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
42 votes in favour.
Green Party.
9 votes opposed.
Act New Zealand.
5 in favour.
Maori Party.
Split vote, 2 opposed, 3 in favour.
Progressive.
1 vote in favour.
United Future.
1 vote in favour.
Any other votes?
Members, the ayes are 110, the noes are 11. The motion is agreed to. I will report this bill without amendment.
Members, the House is resumed.
Mr Speaker, the committee has considered the Tariff and Malaysia Free Trade Agreement Amendment Bill and reports it without amendment. Mr Speaker, I move that the report be adopted.
The question is that the report be adopted. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. For the contrary, no. The ayes have it. The bill is set down for third reading forthwith. The Honourable Tim Grosser.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Tariff Malaysia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement Bill be now read a third time. I do want to respond to the interesting debate in previous stages of this bill. I want to thank the Select Committee for their work, all members. I want to thank all members for their contributions in this debate. I do want to acknowledge the support of the opposition, the Labour Party, for this bill. Of course, it is part, as they themselves have made in several of their interventions, part of a broader pattern by which we've moved quite consciously and quite deliberately to essentially taking out of the partisan arm wrestle this issue. And I just, in the context of this bill, want to emphasise the importance this has had in a very real and practical sense for New Zealand. Now, for other reasons which I won't go into, the fact that my mother's passed away became a matter of wide public comment in New Zealand. And I was going through her papers a week or two ago, and like all mothers and grandmothers and all fathers and grandfathers, she proudly cut out things that her children, her grandchildren were doing. And one of them she cut out was an article written by me congratulating the former Prime Minister Helen Clark and the then Chief Executive of Hong Kong, Tung Chee-hwa, for initiating the beginning of a Hong Kong-New Zealand FTA. Now, it's a matter of public record that this negotiation failed in its first iteration, or its second iteration, to be frank. Prior to that, when I was working in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and was the principal economic advisor to it, I had negotiated in principle an earlier attempt to do this with Hong Kong, and that too failed in the sense of not working at that time. And only on the third attempt to implement the strategy did we actually succeed. And as Ms Street will recall, she and I went up to the signing ceremony in Hong Kong a month or so ago. Finally, New Zealand nailed this agreement. Now, there's a couple of interesting lessons that are just as applicable to this bill that emerge from that. One is the importance of consistency of strategy. The second is flexibility on tactics. Our first two attempts failed, but the strategy behind them was correct. With respect to consistency, the reason why we eventually nailed this agreement with the separate customs territory of Hong Kong, Macau, was because we were able, as a small country the size of Sydney, to maintain a completely consistent policy approach. So I repeat, it is very important for this country with so little material power to have a consistent policy which can sustain itself over the phase of the electoral cycle, and then complete flexibility on tactics. With respect to Hong Kong, what we were trying to do was push the door open, of course, to China. In the event our tactic didn't work, it proved possible only to go right to Beijing and do the real deal with Beijing first, and then come back and open the Hong Kong door. So our tactics were not right in terms of the flux of international politics at the highest level, because this is serious stuff internationally, but the strategy was right. And that, I think, is a lesson New Zealand needs to bear in mind in dealing with the outside world, remembering that we are 4.5 million people and 0.2% of world trade. The Malaysia FTA, which follows exactly this pattern, I recall having launched the Singapore-New Zealand FTA under the then national government in the 90s, being invited up for, quote, secret talks, unquote, in KL. At that stage, the idea of Malaysia doing an FTA with New Zealand was highly controversial. And then we have had, 13 years of time has lapsed to the point where we're now able to, I think, address this matter in a formal parliamentary sense, and I celebrate New Zealand's success once again. But the story is the same. The strategy must be consistent. The tactics need to be completely flexible because we need to adjust to the political realities of the major trading countries and much larger countries than us. Otherwise we will fail. So we were able, in the case of Malaysia, to start to begin a dialogue when their policy structures were not sympathetic to moving this forward. We were then able to move this forward in the context of the ghastly acronym ANZFTA, the Australia-New Zealand ASEAN Free Trade Negotiations, which are only now being phased in since the beginning of this year. And the lesson, once again, is consistency of strategy, flexibility in tactics. And I think it's only when you look back, Mr. Speaker, that you can see how far you have travelled. New Zealand has travelled a great distance on these issues, a country which I've always argued suffered more than any country in the developed world from lack of access to markets. And there are numerous econometric studies, putting aside my own distaste for econometric studies, other more rounded economic studies that indicated in the 1980s New Zealand, which was then suffering from acute lack of access opportunities for our traditional products. That showed in a relative sense this impacted more negatively on New Zealand than any developed country in the world. I might just, in that context, take up one point made by Mr. Shearer in his remarks about commodities. I share, and I think most members of the House would share his frustration at our relative slow progress in taking advantage of higher value products, moving up the value-added chain. The way these days I'd express that concept, because we've been debating this as a country for 30 years, is to participate in the global supply chain. And it is a big challenge for us. The global supply chain is where the action is. 58% of world trading goods, according to the latest OECD study, are intermediate goods. In other words, you don't have vertically integrated production, everything made in New Zealand, and then you export. If you want to gain into the really sophisticated features of modern international trade, you produce components or bits of the global supply chain. This requires a shift in our thinking as a country. And it's quite challenging, of course, for some people who still think in traditional terms that everything must be produced 100% in New Zealand. But if we want as a country to move up the value-added chain, if we want to participate on where the real action is, I agree with Mr. Shearer, this is where we have to go. The point of which I would, I don't know whether I'm disagreeing or not, but draw to his attention, is these FTAs do address one aspect of that. And I'll just introduce the technical terms of it for a minute. It's called tariff escalation. The problem for New Zealand historically in getting out of the commodity trap has been the cost issue of tariff escalation, which means that countries have wished to import our raw commodities, whether they are wood, whether they are wool, whether they are dairy products, and then they put higher and higher levels of protection around the further processing. So these FTAs actually confined us to a hewer of water. I've forgotten the phrase, Mr. Speaker, but the familiar biblical phrase. Thank you, sir. And it's not because we didn't want to move into these higher value-added areas, but the structure of tariff protection in our markets prevented us from gaining access. So these FTA